Okay, is everybody ready to start? As a hush comes over the room. Welcome all, and we will begin tonight's program with an opening prayer by our host, Msgr. David Sork.
Good evening, and let us pray. God, the creator of us all, in a time when there is so much strife and division, we are thankful that we can come together in a spirit of unity and a striving for mutual understanding, recognizing that a prism shines forth through many colors. Your word and your message comes in many ways. May we come into a greater understanding of each other so that we may indeed recognize all of us as sons and daughters of the one God. You are Lord, who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Msgr. Sork. Introducing the rest of the panel, next to Msgr. Sork is Professor Amir Hussain of Loyola Marymount University, Reverend Reinhard Krauss of UCLA, and Claremont, and anything else we should tag in? Okay. Say it. What seminary?
New Theological Seminary.
New Theological Seminary of the West. Man can't keep a job. And next to me is Rabbi Shulman from the Temple Bethel in La Jolla, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome him back to Dawn. And it's also a remarkable pleasure for four of us were on the first Dawn panel, October 30th, 2001, in this very site. And it's really a pleasure to reunite in that regard. And I don't mean to omit Professor Hussain, who's been with us many times and holds his end up the discussion quite well. So tonight we're talking about the Abraham sacrifice of Isaac, intended sacrifice. Just to run quickly through the story, Abraham is told by God to take his son and go to the mountaintop that God will choose, and there he is to sacrifice his son, Isaac, his only son. And Isaac and Abraham, along with servants, set out and go to, as they go up the mountain, Abraham says to the servants, "You stay here, Isaac and I are going up." And they go up, and Abraham binds Isaac, prepares to make the sacrifice, raises his hand with the death blow, and God stays his hand. This is a remarkable story that has theologians scratching their heads over how to present the story, and tonight we will get into different aspects of it, different interpretations. Certainly the Muslim interpretation is quite different from the Judeo-Christian one. So you're in for a night of learning tonight, which will be good. Let me start with Rabbi Shulman. It's so good to have you back. I'm going to give you first shot to...
That's how you treat me?
I am. Explain the Jewish perspective of the story.
Easy, right?
Okay, well, how long are we going for?
Well, make something out of it. Like you
Make something up, okay.
Rabbis always make something out of anything.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I will do that. A moment of personal privilege. Wow, it is so nice to see so many friends and to be back here and to be back with my friends on the panel and to congratulate you, Bob, and all of the clergy and the congregations for keeping this going since 2001. That's absolutely remarkable. I don't think any of us back then could have imagined that it would be as impactful and as ongoing as that has become. And having left this community 14 years ago and returning this past summer back to Southern California, I can tell you that Dawn Unity stands unique in the way that it brings people and communities together, at least in the experiences I've seen elsewhere. So I am delighted to be here. The girls are fine. Robin sends her love. I think I covered most of the questions my friends want to know. And to those of you who I'm not reunioning with, it's very nice to be here with you. Now, to your question. This story, the binding of Isaac, is read through a Jewish lens in 3 different and distinct ways. And I'll just briefly try to give you those 3, and if you want to go further into that after we hear more, we can do that. The first is reading the biblical text itself and understanding internally to the Bible what is happening there. That's actually not quite as complicated as we think. The Bible and the authors of the Bible bringing of this story have a very clear vision of what's happening there. This is the 10th of the tests of Abraham by God to determine Abraham's ability to be the patriarch and to bring monotheism into the world. It is the ultimate test. It is an incredibly difficult test. Bob, you gave us a quick summary of the text. One of the interesting things about this 22nd chapter of Genesis is that it is the most detailed story in the Torah. It's not a quick read story. It's actually a very carefully constructed text that has a number of layers of what's happening there, which we can come back to. But so the first thing is to see how the Bible sees it. Bottom line, from the Torah, from the Bible's point of view, God is determining Abraham's absolute allegiance and loyalty to God, and you and I may not like it, but Abraham passes the test. And it is introduced as a test. The second level of reading that is the rabbinic tradition, which brings all sorts of lore and interpretation and insight to the story because the rabbis of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries who are writing these legends, these midrashim, are incredibly unhappy with the biblical narrative. They don't think Abraham passed the test at all. They're incredibly unhappy. And so if we get the chance, we can talk through some of the ways they recast the story and actually yearn for the Abraham of Sodom and Gomorrah who challenges God rather than who acquiesces to this kind of a command. So the first is the internals of the Bible, much more detail to do there. The second is the way the rabbinic tradition comes to interpret and re-express the story. And the third way this story is read is by generations of Jews ever since who grapple with the text and who try to find some sense of meaning or reason or faith or deeper insight from the text. And that's where you and I come in. Because if you grapple with this text, you find any number of things to be excited about, to be moved by, and any number of things to be greatly disturbed by and to find challenging to your own sense of conscience. So those are the 3 ways by which the tradition reads the text. The detail, kind of what that is, I think we'll have to save for the second go-round.
We'll get to it.
Good.
Let us adjourn.
Give it to you. Oh, I thought it was Reinhard's turn.
No, I'm the moderator. I got to get my own microphone. Yeah, that's anyway. Msgr. Sork, let me ask you from the Catholic perspective, are there elements in here which are related to the sacrifice of Jesus? Is it interpreted in that way?
That's one of the things. That Jesus is seen as being the Father sacrificing Jesus in the same sense. However, the other part of it is focusing on the faith of Abraham and how in our Christian tradition he becomes a model of a person of faith. Let me just read a couple of passages from the New Testament that refer specifically to that. This is Hebrews. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was ready to offer his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac descendants shall hear his name. He reasoned that God was able to raise even from the dead and received Isaac back as a symbol. So yeah, you're right, Bob, there's a lot of parallels as far as Jesus is concerned, but also it's meant to be motivating followers of Jesus to be people of faith, and Abraham is considered a great example of that.
Was there a concept of resurrection involved in this as well? I mean, could that have been in Abraham's mind?
No.
Okay.
No, I think the focus, at least from our perspective, has to do with the faith that Abraham had shown because God had asked him to do something he did not totally understand, but he followed. So we often, in our tradition, refer to Abraham as our father in faith. So in that sense.
Thank you. Professor Hussain, give us the Muslim story.
Yeah,
Please.
thanks, Bob, and thanks to all of you for being here. So Abraham's crucial in the Quranic narrative. So about 245 verses of the Quran, about 25 chapters talk about Abraham. He's the second most mentioned prophet in the Quran after Moses, which surprises people. Like Moses is the most mentioned prophet in the Quran. Abraham's second, and so the story is an interesting one. If you like, Bob, I can read the verses about the sacrifice because people may not know that story. And this is in chapter 37 of the Quran, verses 99 to 113. It's really interesting because the Quranic text jumps around. Sometimes it's second person, sometimes it's God speaking in the first person, sometimes it's the plural. And so the text, he, and the he's understood to be Abraham, he said, I'm going to my Lord who will guide me. My Lord, give me one of the upright. Then it shifts to the voice of God. God, brought him the good news of a forbearing son. When he reached the age of working with him, he said, my son, I've seen in sleep that I am to sacrifice you. What do you think? He said, my father, do what you are commanded. You will find me, God willing, to be one of the patient. When they both submitted to God and he laid him on his forehead, we called out to him, this is God speaking, Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. Like this we reward all those who do good. This was a clear trial. We redeemed him with a great sacrifice. We left him among the later generations. Peace upon Abraham. Like this do we reward those who do good. He was one of our believing servants. We brought him and the good news of Isaac, a prophet, one of the upright. We blessed him and Isaac. Of their offspring are those who do good, and those who do clear wrong to themselves. So that's that story. So chapter 37, verses 99 to 113 in the Quran. And what's fascinating is a couple of things. One is the son is actually never named. The Quran says that Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son. We can get into this later on. The majority Muslim tradition thinks that the son being sacrificed is the first son, Ishmael. The minority Muslim tradition is sort of interesting that within the Muslim tradition there's a difference of opinion. The minority tradition says no, it's actually Isaac, the same son that's in the Islamic, in the Jewish text. The other interesting difference, and some of you picked up on this, in the biblical text, Abraham doesn't say anything to Isaac about what he's going to do. In this text, he does. My son, I've seen that I'm to sacrifice you. What do you think? He, the son, says, my father, do what you were commanded. You will find me, God willing, to be one of the patient. And the Muslim tradition talks about the fact that, we don't use contemporary terms like agency. This giving agency to the son, but the idea that the son has a part to play in this story. The son is a willing participant, in this, and that the submission of the son is seen as powerful, just like Abraham, and the idea of the trial. This was a clear trial, so that same idea is there. But again, I think in the discussion we can talk about some of the other differences and interesting parts of the story.
Well, let me ask about one of the differences there. Islam, of course, means submission.
Right.
And I find when I read the Quran, there are multiple times when I see that being brought forth as the subject. In this particular instance, the son, whether it's Isaac or Ishmael, is not bound, but lays down on the sacrificial altar willingly without being bound. Another sign of submission, very strong sign of submission. I wonder if you want to...
Yeah, and it's interesting kind of thing because you're absolutely right. So the text, if I repeat it, when they both submitted to God and he laid him down on his forehead, we called out to him, Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. Like this, we reward those who do good. So yeah, there's not that sense of, in the biblical Genesis story of the binding, the wood, doing this kind of thing there. But precisely that notion that he's surrendering. He, meaning the son, whichever son it is, we can talk about that. is also surrendering, is also submitting, is also literally a Muslim. That, Islam literally means surrender, submission. A Muslim, one who makes that surrender, one who makes that submission. And so the idea here is that it's not just Abraham who has that same importance for Muslims as he does for Jews and Christians, but the son who has that exemplary quality as well of literally submitting, surrendering.
And we will get back to that in the issue of the sons, but Reverend Professor Krauss, would you want to weigh in on some part of this? I don't want to leave you out by any means.
No, but I think the bases have all been covered. I wonder, and this is maybe a question back to Professor Hussain, do you think that it's possible that the name of the son is deliberately not mentioned because his function is important rather than his descendancy or which son it is, his function as the one who submits to God's will? And the other question I have is, I don't speak Arabic like you do, but what is the exact phrasing in the dream? Is Abraham commanded to sacrifice the son, or is he simply seeing himself sacrificing the son? Because I think that makes a difference to the interpretation of the story.
So let me just start with the second part first, that it is a command, and it's that divine command. And the dream is sort of interesting because, this idea, and I go back to my great Jewish teacher, no disrespect to Rabbi Shulman, the Blessed Leonard Cohen, who, well, absolutely. And, as I grew up in Canada, so you got to represent, I think. Leonard's, buried as a good Jewish boy in Montreal, having lived here for 40 years. But, you know where I'm going with this. The story of Isaac, Leonard Cohen's song, really fascinating, written after the Six-Day War and the kinds of things there. But, he has this line in the song, "A dream is not a vision." And it's really interesting kinds of things that, in the Quranic account, I think in the biblical accounts as well, dreams are very powerful things. They're not imaginary, I dreamt this, it wasn't real. This is more real than real. To encounter the prophet in a dream is just as powerful as to encounter that. I mean, you think about, not getting into a whole other story, the Saul-Paul story, this encounter here. But anyway, so that this notion that in this dream, there's this command to do this. And Abraham does what he is commanded to do, that this is a trial, and the Quran is very clear on this, that this is God testing him. This is one of the trials that Abraham goes through. And I think it's an interesting point to say that, because the son isn't named, does that talk about the fact that it doesn't matter which son it is, what matters is that you do this, you do what God commands of you, and this idea that, you do have the other son, the son that's named Isaac, because the text ends, we brought in the good news of Isaac, a prophet. We blessed him, the him understood to mean Abraham and Isaac. Of their offspring are those who do good, those who do clear wrong to themselves. And this idea of, you have examples here. You have the example of people who are supposed to do the right thing and people who do the wrong kinds of things, to be more like the people who do the right things, regardless of what their names are.
The Quran is very difficult to follow in any kind of a time sense because it jumps around so much. Where you can argue whether the Torah is actually chronologically correct or not, and I think we'll get into that in a little bit. But it says in the beginning, as soon as the son was able to walk. So this is a very young son. Walk or work?
To work.
Okay, that's older, I'm sorry.
But still, I mean, and there's all sorts of interesting debates there about how old is the son, what goes on, all this kind of stuff. And then, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but in the Islamic understanding of things, there's a huge importance to Abraham and Ishmael in the sense that, with the Genesis story, after Hagar and Ishmael are sort of sent away by Sarah, there's no real return other than that one lovely line where when Abraham dies, Isaac and Ishmael come back together and bury their father. So the biblical text doesn't really talk a whole lot about Ishmael. The Quranic text sort of takes him out of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, sends him down the Hijaz into Mecca, and the importance of Abraham and the son building the first place of prayer, the Kaaba. Does the sacrifice take place at Mina, at a place near Mecca? Does it take place in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah? Really interesting kinds of things there, not just which son it is, but where does it happen? What's the importance there? If there's a blessing on both the sons, and if Ishmael is the sort of progenitor of the Arabs and Isaac is the progenitor of the Jews, then is the fact that it's Ishmael give privilege to the Arabs? If it's Isaac, that give privilege to the Jews? And all these really interesting kinds of things in this story. Yeah.
Go back some more now on the rabbinical interpretation of this one. Please.
So I want to pick up a couple of the comments that we just learned and talk about the role of Isaac in the story for a moment biblically, and then we'll move into the rabbinic text. So we think, we meaning biblical historians, that the original version of this story was written in what we called northern Israel, in the northern kingdom. It's represented by something that we often refer to as the E document in the theories of the different texts that create the biblical text. And I want to read you from that original sense the story for a moment and see what's familiar and see what's different. And they came to the place that God had said to him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and he bound Isaac, his son, and put him on the altar on top of the wood. First thing I want to note is that Isaac, while differently than the Quran describes it, is also not fighting. He's willing. He lays down. He has a sense something unusual is happening. In rabbinic tradition, Isaac is probably 34 years of age. In biblical count, he's probably 17 years of age. Who's to really say? But he's old enough to fight back if this is something he doesn't want to acquiesce to. Anyway, so he puts him on top of the wood. Abraham put out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And God said, I swear that because you did this thing and did not withhold your son, your only one, that I'll bless you and multiply your seed like the stars of the skies and like the sand on the seashore, and your seed will possess its enemies' gates, and all nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed because you listened to my voice. And Abraham went back to his boys, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. What do you notice in that in that original casting of the story? What you notice in that original casting of the story is that Abraham kills Isaac. And God says, and because you did what I asked you to do, things will go well for you going forward with the covenant I have promised you. As the biblical text is being redacted and edited in the early days of biblical Israel, this doesn't sit well with the Southerners, the folks who we call responsible for the J document. The J document is the original source of the book of Genesis and much of the Hebrew Bible, and so the redactor combines the two stories and says there's some things we have to change in the story. Among the things we have to change in the story is Isaac has to live. And so the way many of us are familiar with the story, there's a ram and it's found and it's substituted and everything is okay, and the angel comes down and says, no, don't do this. But that's edited back to create, even in the biblical mind, a more palatable story. What would it mean to the covenant God has promised Abraham in the biblical context if Isaac isn't there to lead to the next generation? And it is absolutely interesting that the next time we do see Isaac in the Hebrew Bible, it's at his father's funeral. Here's where the rabbis take off. And the rabbinic tradition looks at this, and I'll give you 3 examples quickly. My personal favorite is the example that the rabbis imagine a dialogue between God and Abraham, because they remember Abraham's dialogue with God when God said, I want to wipe out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham said, what if there's 50 righteous? What if there's 40 righteous? Will you not spare the righteous because they're mixed in with the wicked? Hashofet kol haaretz, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? The rabbis like that, Abraham. I like that, Abraham. That's the birth of conscience. and struggle and moral question. That's the Abraham the rabbis want to see. So God comes and says, take your son. And Abraham, in this imagined rabbinic dialogue, says, which son? I have two sons. Take the one whom you love. What kind of a father would I be if I didn't tell you I love both of my sons? Take Isaac. Right? In other words, the dialogue is Abraham trying to weasel out of it, and God finally having to direct because the language is so detailed that it's Isaac that he wants. Along comes in early medieval period the very famous biblical commentator in Jewish tradition, French teacher Rashi. Rashi comes and reads this very same story and says, wait. You're not reading it right. It doesn't say Abraham bind up Isaac. It says Abraham elevate Isaac to a place of spiritual knowledge that Isaac can be your successor in carrying forward God's covenant. Abraham got the message wrong. And Rashi brings a beautiful midrash where the angels in the heavens watching this are crying and begging God to intervene because Abraham misunderstood God's intent. So you see, what the rabbis are attempting to do is read two things into the story. The moral conscience that they admire about Abraham just a couple of chapters earlier, and their own sense of what it would be to receive such a command, and on the one hand wanting to be faithful to God, and on the other hand not wanting to adhere to, believe in, or follow a God who would make such an unreasonable command. And the rabbinic tradition is filled with those kinds of legends and interpretations and challenges to the biblical text.
All right, let me follow up for a minute. In God, a Biography, Jack Miles makes
He knows, he interviewed him.
Jack Miles won the Pulitzer for it, made the comment that this is the seventh time after the supposed near sacrifice that Abraham has been promised by God that his progeny will be numerous. How can this possibly happen absent Isaac? Ishmael has already been expelled so that the line is clear. The half-son, the illegitimate son, has been expelled, so the one left is the legitimate heir. How can that happen if there's no Isaac? What Sarah is already, she's not going to make another baby.
There's a whole nother story.
Yeah, but she's not going to make another baby unless God wants
She
it.
didn't think she was making the
yeah,
first
all right,
one.
all right. Anything, I get. But how could, how could this promise be kept, and how is that consistent with saying, take your son and sacrifice him?
You want me to address that? Okay. So I talked about how the text is redacted from this E document that is very stark to this redacted JE document that softens around the edges and puts Isaac back into the story so that you can get not only to Isaac, but more importantly, so that you can get where Genesis is headed, which is to Jacob. Okay? When is this redacting happening? This redacting is happening most likely during the age of King David's opportunity to unify the two halves of the ancient land, north and south. When you unify the people and create this new nation, what do you need? You need a defining narrative of what's our history, who are we? And so there's an attempt to look at this story and answer exactly that question. If we're this small people, if we're this people in this place, if we're this people who seem to have to fight and defend for our rights in this land in that ancient time, then let's imagine a faith and a vision and a hope that something else is intended for us, that some larger vision, some larger opportunity, some ultimate victory is there to happen. And the cue or the clue to this in all of the biblical stories of our patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, is that it's never the firstborn son in the Hebrew Bible who is the key character. Okay, because as the Quran correctly points out, Ishmael is the firstborn son, but for us the story is about Isaac. And when you then have Isaac give birth to Jacob and Esau, Esau is the firstborn son, but the story is all about Jacob. And then finally, when Jacob has his 12 sons and a daughter, and the story is ultimately not about Reuben and Levi or Simeon, his first three, it's about Judah, number 4, and ultimately who? Joseph, who brings everybody down into Egypt, the almost youngest son. Right? The message being in that ancient context, in the same way that you might read lyrics or go to a show and get kind of the cultural message of the moment that a generation from now may not understand the reference, the message there is the small, the less will out, will overcome, will prevail. And that's what they're doing in the rabbinic vision, but also in King David's time when the text is being redacted, to deal with that promise of God that doesn't seem by evidence to be potentially fulfilled.
Reverend Krauss, you have invented, I think you invented, I give you credit for inventing the word trialogue of a three-part dialogue. And within your perspective of such a universal look from the three faiths, what lessons do you see that are common or different, not the text itself, but what do we take from this?
I can't take credit for inventing the term trialogue, but I very much like it. I believe that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are closer related than other religions. We are, in a way, at least cousins. And it's a bit like a three-legged stool. If you cut off one leg, you tend to fall over. And I have had experiences when I have talked, say, to, I think it was at Ner Tamid, somebody asked, what about Muslims? And I said, no Muslim is in the room, so let's not talk, but let's bring everybody in. So that's just a little preface. I find myself again and again in the strange position that when I'm engaged in interreligious conversation, I seem to become very Jewish.
How is that?
I like the rabbis. I'm very much ill at ease with this biblical story. What would we do with a person nowadays who would say, God told me to sacrifice my child? We would not only lock them up, but we would lock them up for a long time and put them in a mental institution. So I'm very much drawn to the interpretations of the early rabbis and modern interpretations. And the one I like perhaps best is the one that says, far from God tempting or putting Abraham to the test, Abraham puts God to the test. In the sense of saying Abraham knew from his conversation about Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham argues, you cannot inflict collateral damage. You cannot, as the justice of all the earth, kill the innocent with the guilty. And God says, all right, Abraham, you got a point. I can't do it. And Abraham wins the argument. This is the chapter right before the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And I like the interpretation best that Abraham gets this command and knows that God cannot kill the innocent. And so he goes through the motions. And God blinks. He calls it off because of who God is. So there are other interpretations, but I'm very ill at ease with the story, especially in the original version that Rabbi Shulman recited in the biblical text. I also very much like the Quranic version where the son actually has agency, and to say this is not simply that is being inflicted on me by some divine power, but I have some say in this relationship with God, whether I submit or not submit. And traditionally also the story has been taken, I think, both in the Jewish and the Islamic version to say you could read the story from the punchline back to say religions around the people of Israel practiced child sacrifice, and we see traces of that very clearly in the prophetic literature, and that the God of Israel says, you are not to do this. So the story is to be read from the end to say, that the God of Israel does not demand child sacrifice. Indeed, he forbids the founding father of his people to kill the son. So I like other versions or interpretations better, but it requires some midrash.
Msgr. Sork, when I first issued this a draft for the schedule for the topics this year, I had labeled this the binding of Isaac, which the Akedah, as it's known in Hebrew, and is how the Jews call it, the binding of Isaac. And you said that Catholics would not recognize it by that title, and I'm curious as to, I'm not sure how to ask the question, but how would Catholics recognize this story, and why not as the binding of Isaac?
I think more likely the sacrifice is a more familiar term for the Catholic tradition. And it's probably also related, Bob, that something you brought out at the beginning is that we look upon the idea of Jesus sacrificing himself for us. We often refer to him as the Paschal Lamb. Mm-hmm. And again, paralleling the lamb and sacrifice. I'd like to just add something just to
Please.
Lighten up this group for a second. And that is the discussion about the age of Isaac when he was up for a sacrifice.
Good question.
And the answer is, not sure the age, but he would have either been 12 years of age or under, or 20 years of age or over. Because if he were a teenager, it wouldn't have been a sacrifice for the father.
Okay. You did your job. You lightened that one up. I also was struck in thinking about this, about the parallel that here is Isaac carrying his wood up the hill for his sacrifice. That another analogy that I'm sure is persistent in Christian thinking.
The other thing I might also add is the role of St. Paul in the early church. St. Paul has often been known as the apostle to the Gentiles. And one of in his writings, when he was talking, there was a big dispute in the early church whether a person who became a Christian needed to go through the rite of circumcision and be under the law, and that was, dividing back, and that divided the church.
That was their main sales point.
Yeah, that would work, wouldn't it?
That swung the vote, I assure you.
But anyways, in his writings, when St. Paul was talking about that they were not under the law, he actually used Abraham to bolster his argument. So it was, let me just read a few passages that we have from Paul. One is to the Romans when he says, righteousness depends on faith so that it may be a gift and the promise may be guaranteed to all his descendants, not to those who only adhere to the law, but to those who follow the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. Also in Galatians, he says, thus Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Realize then it is those who have faith who are children of Abraham. Scripture, which saw in advance that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, foretold the good news to Abraham, saying, through you shall the nations be blessed. Consequently, those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, who had faith. So again, as Paul was using him as a kind of a support.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just make a comment about Paul's argument in Romans? He makes the argument that Abraham is made righteous before he is circumcised, right? So that has been the Christian argument. But it leaves out that Paul makes an additional change of saying, therefore, circumcision is optional, which is not what the Hebrew text says. The Hebrew text says, circumcision is not optional. Yes, you need to have faith and you need to obey, but Paul makes the additional change to the canonical scripture of saying, because Abraham had faith before he was circumcised, so therefore circumcision is optional, whereas in the Hebrew text it actually says, those who say, no, I'd rather pass on this one, are being cast out from the people. So it is a significant change, not just a difference in interpretation. Paul claims, and Christians have followed him by and large, to say that he speaks with divine authority, but it is clearly a change in the scripture that he has inherited, not just a slightly different interpretation. So that just as a little clarification.
Professor Hussain, we in looking at the Muslim commentations as we see it, there is usually a distinction made for the argument that a different group or a different something in the choice of whether this is Isaac or Ishmael. Is there something deeper involved in that?
It's a great question. And I was just thinking, when Professor Krauss was talking about, what do you do in the modern world? And that unfortunately happened here. I mean, I moved here in 1997 from Toronto, and one of the first sort of books that someone gave me was a book called Abraham on Trial, The Social Legacy of Biblical Myth. It was a woman, Carol Delaney, who was an anthropologist, who was actually covering a case here in California, not here in Los Angeles, Northern California, where a man actually had believed that God had commanded him to sacrifice his, in this case, the youngest child. It was a daughter, and he actually did it. And of course, we think that's criminally insane. And he was found to be, criminally insane. That's in the modern period, that's the kind of thing. And where I'm going with this is that what she writes about isn't that part of the story, but this notion that, so what does that mean? Because the subtitle was The Social Legacy of Biblical Myth, and the idea of what does it mean that you have ownership over your children, that, you can do what you want with your children. Really interesting kinds of things there. You mentioned Jack Miles, whose, first book won a Pulitzer Prize, God, a biography. Yes. His second book won a MacArthur Genius Grant, Christ, A Christ and the Life of God. His third book is actually coming out this fall. It's a book on the Quran. I'm not sure, Jack and I are friends, so I've seen an advanced copy of it, and it's brilliant as it usually is. I can't remember what the exact title is going to be, but it's something like God Again, and this time it's the Quran. And he talks about, you can't understand the Quran without knowing the Bible, that the Quranic text is very elliptical, it's very elusive, because the hearers of the Quran in the 7th century have some familiarity with the biblical story. They know the stories of Abraham, they know the stories of Moses, they know the stories of Joseph and Jacob and the 12 and all that kind of thing. It's what does it mean and how do you understand that? In the same way, what I read to you was really just the text of the Quran, but there's all sorts of, the Muslim equivalent of the rabbinical and Talmudic literature, all the commentators, what happened, how did this take place, where did it happen? One of my favorite ones is someone says, well, okay, so where did this sacrifice happen? If the sacrifice happened in Arabia, in the Hijaz, what had to have been Ishmael, because Isaac never went there. If it happened in, he uses Syria, by Syria means Israel, Palestine, Jerusalem, then it had to be Isaac, because Ishmael never went there. And so you have this interesting, people aware of these stories, people aware of the sons, people aware of the importance. In Mecca, of course, you've got the importance of Mecca is not because Muhammad was born there, even though he was born there. The importance of Mecca is not because the Quran was revealed there, even though the Quran was revealed there. It's because this is where Abraham comes and builds the first place of prayer, the Kaaba. And so, part of it is that sense of in many ways, it's like and Rabbi Msgr Sork, read Galatians. One of my favorite lines of Paul is that line in, 3:28, 3:29 in Galatians, where everyone remembers the first part of, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. No one goes to the end of that verse 29. If you are Christ, then you are Abraham's heirs according to the promise. How do you graft yourself onto this tradition? I think, interestingly, that's what, no disrespect, and that's what Christians are doing. That's what Muslims are doing to this kind of story, because you have this kind of figure of Abraham that's deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition. How do Christians, who come along hundreds of years later, root themselves in that story? How do Muslims who come along 600 years after Christianity root themselves, in that story and make use of that story and tell it in really interestingly different, but not, I would say, unrecognizable, kinds of ways?
Well, the fact that the text says they went to Mount Moriah,
Right.
and the fact that the Dome of the Rock is supposedly the rock where, how can there then be a conflict between whether the sacrifice happened in Arabia or in...
And I think, and that's just the question of, that's just the argument for those who say it's Isaac versus those who say it's Ishmael, because, and there's many things Rabbi Shulman said that really stayed with me. One of them was this really powerful idea. I hadn't really thought about this till, Rabbi, you articulated it, about these are not the firstborn sons. These are the second, the third, the 12th. This, for me in the Bible, is one of the real powerful moments here. By that I don't mean the Abraham story. I mean that this is the God of widows. This is the God of orphans. This is the God of strangers. This is the God of exiles. This is not the God of, the powerful and the mighty and that kind of thing. This is the God of we would call the marginalized here. And so in a funny way, that goes back, to the Islamic story of what happens when Sarah kicks out, Hagar and Ishmael. The Quran sort of picks up on that story. The Islamic tradition picks up on that story and says, okay, when they're forced out, where do they go? Well, they go down to Arabia. They go to Mecca. The well of Zamzam that waters the pilgrims to this day is revealed under the feet of the child Ishmael. Then Abraham comes and visits, because in the Islamic story, there's differences here. In the Islamic story, Hagar isn't a concubine. Hagar's a wife. He's it's a polygamous society. Hagar is one of his wives. Sarah is another one of his wives. So there's no issue of legitimacy for Muslims in the way that there is in the biblical tradition of who's the legitimate son and who's the illegitimate, son. In the Islamic tradition, these are just multiple wives that he's got. And so, but that goes to the story that, if they're they meaning Hagar and Ishmael are in Mecca and Abraham comes and does this, where does this take place? Part of the pilgrimage rituals are Muslims gathering together pebbles and throwing them at 3 pillars near Mina, which represents Satan. And that's part of that temptation story, which for Muslims has to do with this story. That, when Abraham is commanded to do this, does Satan intervene? Does Satan say, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this, maybe you shouldn't do what God tells you to do? And this is why Abraham throws these stones. So really interesting kinds of things. Does the story happen on Mount Moriah with Abraham and Isaac? Does the story happen in Mecca with Abraham and Ishmael? And commentators differ on that.
You were making notes, do you want to got stuff to say?
On many things.
You're just writing, or what are you doing?
Yeah, I'm taking notes, I'm learning.
And you're learning. Oh, okay. We charge tuition for that. Let me ask, one of the things that you rabbis do to your congregation is...
Brian, help me, Brian.
...is you pick little things of great significance in the text, in the Hebrew text.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, the story, chapter 22 of Genesis, begins with Lech Lecha.
Yeah.
And explain that to everyone, please.
Now, you know, the notes I was writing, I want to do a lot of little things, big things with little things in the text. I'll explain that, and I'll explain a few things. So in Genesis chapter 12, we meet Avram for the first time before he's even called Abraham, and he's told, Lech lecha, go forward to the land that I will show you. That's the beginning of his journey, and it is here in 10 chapters later in chapter 22 that it's that very same language that is brought, that God says, and Abraham in theory recognizes this, oops, I'm going on another journey, I'm going off to a place that God will show me, and in this case it's in the biblical text Moriah where the event takes place. But the language in the Hebrew text is crucial to a Jewish understanding of the story. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, when we meet God as a character in this narrative, bringing this instruction, and in essence the word is Nisa, God is testing Abraham, it doesn't say God, it says Veha Elohim, the God. Now on the one hand, you could argue it's about the ultimate sovereign. On the other hand, most readers of the text argue it's about God trying to be actually a little distanced from the command. You know, if God wanted to talk directly to Abraham, he's done that often. He could say, hi Abe, how are you today? I got another task. But the narrator says, the God, that impersonal being, that impersonal deity, came to test. Then, as the text goes on, 3 times Abraham has to respond to God's call. The first time, God says, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham says, Hineni, here I am. And the reader is led to imagine proud, responsive, here I am. God, you're calling me, here I am. Then comes the instruction, and Abraham comes to understand something more about what's going to be, and now he and Isaac are on their 3-day journey, and Isaac, as you alluded to, is carrying the wood and the flint, and they're going on the road, and suddenly it occurs to Isaac, there's everything here for a sacrifice except the animal. And so he says, hey Dad, and Abraham says, Hineni. Yeah, here I am. I get that this feels strange to you, doesn't it, son? And finally, we get to the dramatic moment where the knife is hanging over Isaac's neck, and you have to imagine coming down, and suddenly it's not the God, it's not any form of God that would be personal to Abraham, it's the angel, the messenger of God, even further removed from God personally being engaged and involved in this moment, who calls out twice, Avraham, Avraham. Like, we don't have time to call out twice. There's a knife coming down. And Abraham says, and again you're led to believe somewhat squeamishly and sheepishly, yeah, here I am. The first time in the Hebrew Bible the word love appears is in God's description to Abraham of why it's Isaac he should take. The one you love. It's not romantic love. It's not friends or some other kind of bond. It's a father being tested at the primary place of being, that son that you love. I'm going to ask you to consider doing something with him. Because if God says to Abraham, Abraham, sacrifice yourself so that Isaac may live, as difficult as that is, that's not like asking him to offer up his son. So it's these close readings of the text that are actually crucial to a sense of how the Hebrew narrative is carrying us through this with emotion and with a sense of reading ourselves into the story, which then the rabbinic tradition picks up on. All my Jewish friends in the room, you have spent many a morning in September every year in synagogue on the Jewish New Year on Rosh Hashanah. Of all the biblical chapters we could choose to read on the Jewish New Year, on the first day of our New Year, we read about the surprising birth of Isaac and the banishment of Sarah and Hagar. This is a Happy New Year story. And on the second day, we read this very story of the binding of Isaac. We read that because these are the formative stories that lay out our relationships with each other, with our families, and with God as we do the internal work that the High Holiday New Year season is about. And the text is so detailed, and we make a big deal out of these little nuances and these little words because that's how the Hebrew Bible communicates meaning to us.
Okay, if this is in some sense a foundational story to pattern one's life after, it raises for me the question, what is moral? What is morality? What is ethics? Is moral whatever God commands, or is God bound by what is moral? So, this is the fundamental question the story raises for me, and how is that question answered in the Jewish tradition? Certainly not in the sense, as I understand it, that God can command whatever. If God were the devil, we should follow. But God is in some fundamental sense a moral God, and he cannot ask what is immoral. I'm not sure this is a question that is answerable, but it's to me a question that's at the very root of the story.
So with your permission, let me offer a thought. I would suggest we read these stories at every different stage of our life where they engage us, and we come at different moments to different insights and different understandings. My current place of understanding of this story sits on two thoughts. And remember, at the very beginning I suggested there's the way internally the text works in the Hebrew Bible. There's the way the rabbinic tradition tries to grapple with that and reinterpret that. And then there's the way you and I read ourselves into the story and try to take something from it. So the two things that I currently see as the moral message of the text, the first is the following. Right? Have faith, understand God's covenant, understand your relationship to God, but question it always. Challenge it always. Don't assume what you thought today is what you will think tomorrow. Be in dialogue and relationship with God through the very questions and challenges, holding God to that same moral standard that you're expecting God to hold you to. So that's one place where I land currently in trying to read and understand and bring together these different strands of the story. And the other, maybe it's born just out of we keep collecting life experiences. The other is, I said earlier that I think God's command of Abraham is an unreasonable expectation. And I will hold God accountable in my moral compass and in my composition of faith for that unreasonable expectation, and I reject that that's what I think God would want from a follower. On the other hand, unreasonable expectations move us really far. We have all responded to what we thought was impossible, and we actually achieved it, or we overcame it, or we figured our way through it, or we grappled with it, or we struggled with it, or we fought back. There is something to be said in the character of one's own life journey for responding to and dealing with unreasonable expectations. And I think there's also a certain faith perspective there, especially given in the Jewish tradition how the story follows and flows, to the next chapters in terms of what become the covenantal expectations for Abraham's descendants.
But in order to raise that question, you have to believe that the command was real. That
I don't accept that at all.
all right.
I mean, I don't. Let's let them share their faith perspectives. My faith perspective doesn't assume anything in this text at all is real. My assumption of these texts is that these are religious memories written down by people who had a variety of experiences, and they're trying to do what you and I are trying to do. They're trying to interpret what life means. They're trying to figure out how to root themselves and guide themselves through this mystery and this gift. And so we have incredibly powerful stories of faith and mystery and wonder and memory, but I don't take any of it literally. That's why it's meaningful to me, because I don't take it literally. I take it seriously. I take it for purpose. I take it ethically. I'm challenged by it. I love the story. My Ner Tamid friends heard me say on many Rosh Hashanah, this theological thriller is my favorite story in the Torah. But not because it's an easy story and a comfortable story, but because I can really struggle and argue and grow through the study of this story.
But real, let me finish. But real means more. Yeah, because when I'm saying real, Abraham says to the servants, he and I are going to go up and then we will come back.
Yes.
And right, the ram is there. So it seems like it was never meant to be, is what I mean by real.
So let me just answer that one detail, and then I really want to hear what they think.
Yes.
When Abraham says to the servants, "We will be back," again, I'm going to bring the rabbinic tradition now. They read that as hopeful, wishful thinking. This really isn't going to happen. We will be back. But the biblical reading of the text, other than that dramatic, scary part in the E document where maybe it really happened, in the larger redacted biblical reading, the text that we actually have and study and live through, the story actually isn't about Isaac, which is a point you made in terms of the Quran. It's actually not about Isaac. The story's about Abraham. And so it's not that Isaac's not going back with him. It's that we need to know that Abraham is going back, because the next verses are about Abraham being blessed by God in the renewal and the affirmation of the covenant. I, however, am sympathetic to Msgr. Sork's thought that Isaac saw this happening, and he said, "Dad, you go home, I'm out of here." Because really, why would you go home after this moment? You would take a break. You would try to go sort out what this meant. If Abraham's supposed to be transmitting to his son his faith in God, and if they're the pioneers in this monotheistic vision, I'm not so sure he's teaching Isaac exactly in the most effective way.
Would you want to follow?
Yeah, please, argue with me.
No, I don't want to argue with you. I agree. And one of the interpretations I've read, again, from the rabbis says the support for this interpretation that Isaac leaves, because how many years on a therapist's couch would it take to remedy that situation between your dad, who is ready to kill you and is prevented not by his own decision, but by some divine intervention. I'm not sure whether that relationship could ever be repaired. The very next chapter in the Torah has Sarah die. And some rabbis said she died from a broken heart after Abraham came home by himself and told her the story of what happened. So the wrecking of the family unit, the relationship, was taken as proof by some of the rabbis to say Abraham actually did not fulfill the test but fail it. It's an interpretation that goes against the plain meaning of the text, or at least the framing of the story that says Abraham passed the test. But I think it's worth considering, and like Rabbi Shulman, I like this idea of what I like to call dancing with the text, because it's not a text that is a straight narrative, and as some clergy say, and let me tell you what the meaning of the, rabbis don't do this, what the meaning is, but to say we have to wrestle, we have to grapple. It is very difficult, it is challenging, and in fact, I would say the biblical text, and I would have you maybe chime in, the biblical text, as I understand it, is really a conversation among a family. and we are to listen in and slowly enter the conversation and become part of the conversation as we identify with different characters. But it is an ongoing conversation. It is not an old document where we should ask ourselves, did this really happen and when? And could we excavate a sandal strap from Abraham anytime? I think this misses the story. The biblical story has heroes, has models, has crazy uncles, has odd cousins, and we are, if we occupy ourselves with the story and dance with them long enough, find ourselves in the middle with our certainties, with our foibles, with our follies, and with our confidence as well.
So I wanted to say a couple of things there. But my teacher was this extraordinary man, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was like the great Canadian scholar of religion. And his last of his 13 books was a book called What is Scripture? And he begins with this line, "Scriptures are not texts." And I love that, that it's much more than that. A text is a text. Scripture is very different. You work with it, you live with it, you understand it in really powerful sorts of ways. There's all this sort of secondary and tertiary material. In the Islamic tradition, like I said, it's an exact parallel, a parallel with like the rabbinic, the commentary tradition, all that kind of stuff. So there's wonderful things about, the son asking the father to make sure that his clothes are pulled back so that there's no blood that gets on them when he's going to be sacrificed, to take the shirt back to his mother, to offer comfort. But that's that whole, and you think about that world and think, okay, what do you do when, like washing clothes is a very different, there's no laundry machines with Tide that you can throw them in, what do you do? But to give the shirt back to the mother, to comfort her, and that's a parallel in the Quran, that the Joseph story in the Quran, that, the Joseph's father goes blind, crying at grief because he thinks that his son is, the brothers tell him, the dad, that the son has been killed eaten by wolves, because somehow that's a better story than saying we sold him to slavery. Because I don't understand these kinds of stories of on what planet does that one make sense to say, hey, let's tell dad he was eaten by wolves because he'll go for that one, rather than, we sold him into slavery. But that the son, Joseph, sends the father, Jacob, the shirt. And it's literally the smell of his son on his shirt that the father can recognize that gives him eyesight back. So, there's a power in these stories, and that goes back, and Rabbi Shulman, when you were talking about the Lech Lecha and Hineni, it made me think again of Leonard Cohen. If you know Lenny's last record, you want it darker. I teach a comparative theology class, and you may like this, you may be horrified, the text that I use for the Jewish part of that class was "You Want It Darker." Was that record, because it's a very deeply Jewish record where sort of Leonard returns back to the roots, and on that song, "You Want It Darker," he's got Gideon Zellermeyer, who's the cantor at Shar HaShomayim, Leonard's old synagogue in Montreal, singing those lines of Hineni in this sense of, and how much of that is Leonard at 83, getting ready to meet his Lord and understanding that, okay, here I am, and and it's all those kinds of, that for me is the power precisely of these texts, that they speak to us, that they speak to this, 83-year-old guy living in Pico and Fairfax, as much as they speak to someone 2,000 years ago, as much as they speak to someone 500 years ago.
Let's talk about Sarah in this. I think we need to get Sarah in here.
I think Sarah is the subversive character in this story. She is not the submissive wife. She bosses Abraham around all the time in this story. Abraham receives the revelation from his Lord, but whenever Sarah speaks up, whether it's for him to have a child with Hagar, whether it is to kick Hagar out, whether to blame him for Hagar conceiving a child, and eventually casting out Hagar and Ishmael, Abraham is strangely submissive. He does not act as the patriarch. He says, when she comes to him and says, look, I'm not able to conceive. How about if you sleep with my slave, my Egyptian slave? He says, well, okay. Which is a strange.
Don't try this at home. Bad answer.
Yeah. Which is a strange. Puts Abraham in a strange light. So I am not quite sure what to make of this. Is Sarah an early feminist? Is Sarah just a very strong woman? She does not look. She does not come across as very ethical at times. And interestingly enough, and this goes back to the theme of God at times choosing the underdog, it is Hagar who eventually in the desert, and this is the biblical account, not the Quranic account, in the desert, in the wilderness, has a revelation from the divine that is almost on par with Abraham. And she, the divine voice, or the angel she hears, actually names the son, and Abraham obeys Hagar. And in the Quranic version of things, Hagar, the single mother who's raising her child, is becoming the foundress of Mecca. So there is an undercurrent in these stories that goes very strongly against the patriarchal framework of these stories, and I must say I like it.
No, and just picking up on that, I mean, because for Muslims, it precisely is that Hagar story that, in the Islamic accounts, similar to the biblical accounts, Hagar's an Egyptian slave, which in the Islamic writing means she's black, and so this idea that this is where the Arabs come from, this is where the Prophet Muhammad traces his lineage, to a black slave woman, not to this noble lineage of kings and princes. Again, it's that sense of the underdog, kind of moment. And then the same thing, because when Abraham basically tells Hagar and the child, Ishmael, to leave, the Quranic account is really interesting because Hagar just turns to Abraham and says, I'm paraphrasing here, but, so just so I'm clear, is it you telling me this, or is it God commanding this? And Abraham says, it's God commanding it. Hagar's fine. If this is God's will, I'm happy to do that. If it's you, we have some issues. And she doesn't say that, but you get what I'm saying. That sense that Hagar is exactly doing the same kind of thing, that it's not like it's a trial, but it is a trial. To say, God's telling me I need to get out here with my young son as a single mom, which unfortunately, again, that goes back to the contemporary world. Lots of single moms having to do whatever they need to do to take care of their kids. But this idea, this faith, because it's God that's commanded this. It's not Abraham that's doing this. And that's what makes it, okay. But that goes back to your question. I'm not a philosopher, thank goodness, about, does that make it moral? Or was that say for God who does, these kinds of things?
So I want to follow up on that with just one additional thought. And I want to remind us of the distinction I've been making all evening about the biblical text and the way we then come to interpret the text. Within the Bible itself, Abraham mistreats Sarah at every turn. Oh, Pharaoh's going to kill me, you go sleep with him. Oh, let's move over here now, do this, and all these different things. Abraham mistreats Sarah at every turn. It would never play in our culture, nor should it. But I say this with respect for the biblical text and our very different sensibilities. It's not about Sarah. That's why she's not in the story when you get to chapter 22. The story's about Abraham. The story's not about Sarah. Sure, she's got feelings. Sure, she's got concerns. That's not what the editor, the author of the story is thinking about, which is why, now I go back to the rabbinic and our more modern interpretations, which is why people come in and try to correct it. which is why her soul leaves her in the next verses when we turn the page and suddenly we're reading chapter 23, right? Which is why Abraham in a midrash is squeamish to actually tell her what's going to happen, so he chooses not to. This won't play well at home, right? Which is why in so many other ways Sarah is recreated as a stronger woman outside of the biblical text than the way Abraham in fact treats her within the biblical text. And that too, I think, is part of the dynamic of thinking about time and place and origin, context of the text, and how through the generations we read our lives and our stories into the text.
Rabbi, there's a question that's always asked about when we think about Sarah. One of the things that always came to mind with her was when Abraham had the visitors that were going to tell him in a year from now that his wife was going to be with child, and she was listening in, and then she started laughing, and he said, I think it goes something like, "You were eavesdropping, weren't you?" "Oh, no, not me." "Oh, yes, you were." So it adds kind of a levity to that particular situation of Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely, and there is a levity. Isaac means laughter.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because in Hebrew, Yitzchak, because she laughed at the crazy notion that they were suddenly, after all these years and at their age, going to conceive a child. Right? On the other hand, God is very upset that Sarah is laughing, mocking at this revelation, and a little bit later, God says to Abraham, "Was that your wife making fun of what I said would happen?" And Abraham there kind of says, "No, not really." But he knew it was.
But he falls down laughing.
He falls down, yes, he falls down laughing too, because on the face of it, it seemed absurd from their experience.
And she is and in that passage, Sarah actually says, I'm so old we don't sleep anymore. She's talking about senior sex in a sacred text, which we still have trouble talking about and treat in many ways as a taboo. I find that wonderfully refreshing.
Professor Hussain, we have the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and the two are brought together. In the Islamic text and Islamic studies, do the wives of the prophets have as prominent a role?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of thing. I mean, we're coming up now. It's nowhere near as long a history in the biblical or the Christian traditions, but of feminist Quranic interpretations. How do women read this text? So that there's a colleague of mine, Aisha Ayatollah, who teaches at the University of San Francisco, whose book came out a couple, 3 years ago called Feminist Edges of the Quran, which sort of looks at 25 years of feminist scholarship on the Quran, which I think is really fascinating. I think there is this sense of the only, and I want to ask a question both to Msgr Sork and to Professor Krauss, the only woman that's mentioned by name in the Quran is Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's all sorts of other women who are mentioned, but none by name. And so the stories of these women are really interesting. But the story of it's not just like Muslims don't just rely solely and only on the Quran. It's how's that text read, how's that text interpreted. You look at the story of the woman who tempts Joseph. The Quran never gives her a name. Zuleika is the name she's given sort of in the tradition, the wife of Potiphar in the Jewish tradition. Really powerful kinds of ways in which sort of the mystics and the poets completely subvert that literal reading of the text. But the question I was going to ask is, we were talking about mothers and what mothers do for their sons, and of course in the Christian tradition that's Mary. Are there any? I don't know this. Are there any sort of parallels or things in the Christian tradition that link Mary with either Hagar or Sarah with this kind of story or not? I mean, I don't know them, but I'm just sort of curious.
I could offhand I couldn't see that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just because but just especially here, meaning here in Los Angeles, with the Virgin of Guadalupe and the image of the Virgin and this idea of mothers do what they can for their kids. Mothers take care of their kids. Mothers are central in the lives of their kids, and so it's really. I was just thinking about this kind of story of Hagar being out there as the mom, with her son. Here's Mary with.
I mean, as far as I know, there are no explicit connections. However, Mary is portrayed as one of the women under the cross, in some sense suffering with her son, staying with him, similar. One could draw a parallel to Hagar staying with Ishmael and moving a little way and expecting to watch him die. But until you brought it up, I've never made that connection, but all connections have probably been made before.
Well, I just have to, I came across this and I can't leave it out. It's nuts. When you Google, you never know what you're going to find, right? Well, there is a game called The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. Is an internet game that you can get, and it's published by so-and-so and so. Well, wait till you hear the story. This comes from a guy who had a religious upbringing. As with his previous one on Isaac, it's based on the biblical tale of the binding of Isaac and is inspired by his own childhood growing up in a religious family. The player controls a young boy named Isaac, whose mother, convinced she is doing the work of God, strips him of all his clothes and possessions and locks him in his room. With his mother about to sacrifice him, Isaac escapes to the basement and fights through random dungeon creatures, and his weapon becomes his tears, which harden into weapons.
And you think the biblical story is weird?
I don't know. All right, let's see if we have some questions down here. I had to share that one with you. I don't know. While I'm walking around, maybe somebody on the panel wants to answer whether trivializing the Bible is a positive or negative thing. I don't know what to make of that. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have been reading a little bit of history, and to remove it from the different religious series, at that time, the Jewish women who were beginning to accept Judaism also were Baalists, and I feel that we try to say that killing of a child and sacrificing it to God is wrong, and that this was a lesson that was trying to be taught to us. And I'm wondering what your reaction is, because historically, this seemed to be happening.
Hi, Ellen. Nice to see you. Reverend Krauss referred to the idea of child sacrifice earlier as well in thinking about this. And we know elsewhere in Deuteronomy, we know elsewhere in the prophets, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible makes a strong case against those kinds of practices that we're seeing in the areas around. The problem is this. We want to hope and believe that that's part of the Bible's message, that this is not a practice that should be sustained in Israel. My teacher of these texts, Nachum Sarna, who's one of the preeminent scholars of the book of Genesis, is pretty convinced, and his arguments are pretty convincing, that that's not at all what this text is about. We want it to be about that, because that's our frame of reference. But he's pretty convinced that the text is, as I said at the very beginning, really about God testing Abraham's faith and about their relationship, and everything else we read into the text is on our minds, not the biblical author's minds. So I don't know, but it certainly is an important question for us to wonder about.
Question?
Thank you. To Well, one point and then one question. You guys talked about location a little bit, but in Genesis it doesn't tell us where the land of Moriah is either. It's not until Chronicles, so I don't know if that plays into, I guess, figuring out where this took place and if that's significant within Genesis. But the bigger question I have is the role of the ram, right? The sacrificial animal at the end, and how that plays into the different faith traditions. In Christianity, I guess it could be considered analogous to Jesus in some ways, but just wondering.
Msgr Sork?
Let me start
Reverend Krauss,
with that because, in the Islamic tradition, it's not in the text of the Quran that I read, but the tradition has exactly the same sort of story, that there's a ram and that's the animal that Abraham actually ends up sacrificing. And that goes to sort of the heart of the pilgrimage ritual. So, for Muslims, we're coming up next week is the 9th month of the Muslim calendar, the month of fasting, Ramadan. The 12th month of the Muslim calendar is the month of pilgrimage. And part of the pilgrimage rituals is literally the celebration is called the Eid al-Adha. It's connected with Aqidah. The sacrifice of the animal, that you do this kind of thing. The head of every pilgrim delegation is supposed to do this on the pilgrimage. Other folks are supposed to do that. If you can't do it, as most of us can't, because most of us don't have backyards with lambs in them, and the neighbors kind of get upset if we sacrifice animals in the backyard. We go to butchers and do that kind of thing. So every year for Muslims, this story is not just told, but lived out in the sacrifice there, and a reminder of that story.
I think it's understandable, and it's part of the biblical tradition to read other events into older texts. And certainly the story of making the analogy between Jesus on the cross and the ram that Abraham sacrificed is a relatively early tradition. At the same time, I find the narrative and the traditional narrative of God slaughtering his own son to be entirely unpalatable, but that's maybe the topic for a different evening. And I also think it's not biblical.
Let me offer a very important rabbinic legend, a midrash about the story. Abraham looks at God in the aftermath and says, I didn't do well. I should have argued with you. I should have withheld from doing this. I should have restrained my impulse and I did not reply as I should have. And so a dialogue goes on in this legend between God and Moses, God and Abraham. And so Abraham says to God, so I need to be repaid now. You need to make this up to me. You asked me to do this terrible thing. I shouldn't have agreed. I did agree. I want this repaired. The Holy One replied, you had your say, now I will have mine. Isaac's descendants will sin in my very presence, and I will have to judge them each year on New Year's Day. That's our Rosh Hashanah service, right? However, should they implore me to seek out some merit on their behalf and to remember on their behalf the binding of Isaac, let them blow in my presence the horn of this creature. And Abraham turned looking for an animal and said, the horn of what creature? And God said, turn around. And at once, quoting the Torah, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a ram. It is the horn of the ram, the shofar, the ram's horn that we sound on our holy days, that does any number of things religiously and communally for us, but that is also seen by the rabbis as God's promise that this went too far, and that for the sins we seek to overcome, for the mistakes and the misdeeds we seek to ask for forgiveness of and correct, the shofar linking back to the ram, linking back to Isaac, will be the vehicle of that tshuva, of that repentance.
And it's fascinating, Rabbi Shulman, when you said that, because again, in the Islamic sort of traditions, there's all sorts of traditions about the horns of that very ram being hung up on the outside wall of the Kaaba, exactly this kind of notion of the importance of those horns.
Wow. Thank you all. Thanks for the panel.